Sunday, February 18th, 2018. Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. I'm going to look at a couple of books today, but before that, I want to talk a bit about Billy and his background. Billy's a credit crunch puppy, and by what I mean by that is that he was born in July of 2008. And how did we get Billy? Well, we had another Shih Tzu, also called Billy, who died beginning of 2008 or spring of 2008, and he was 13 and a half. We had him since a puppy as well. Our daughter was born a year after Billy the first, if you want to call him that. And we decided to, I looked at the Kennel Club website and I found a breeder near our house and we went there. It was around September time, I think just after the Lehman collapse. And he was about 8 weeks old and he lived on a farm. The breeder lived on a farm and he had a lot of other dogs. And when I called him, I asked him, do you still have any Shih Tzu puppies left? And he said, yes, we've only got one left. And he's got a name. And I said, what's his name? And he said, Billy No Mates, which is like a kind of an expression here in England. You know, if you're on your own, you're Billy No Mates. And he said all his brothers and sisters are gone. And I can't sell him. The vet bills are running up. He said his wife had died. So he wanted to, actually, he told us that he actually wanted to keep Billy. But he couldn't afford anymore because he had a lot of other dogs. So we went there, my wife and I and my daughter. She was about 12 at the time. We didn't tell her what we were going to do. It was kind of a surprise. Then we got there. And we told her we're going to see puppies. And Billy was there with his mother and his grandma. And they're telling him off, and he was very quiet. And there's also some other bigger dogs there. And we loved him, and we picked him up. And when we were about to leave, the breeder said, oh, can I hold him again? Because he really liked him. So he was the bat, you know, he was the runt, the quiet boy that stayed behind. So that's his background. And I don't like to talk about the price of a dog because I think he's priceless, but we got a good deal because unfortunately the breeder had to, needed the money. So he was a bargain in terms of a Shih Tzu price. I won't tell you the price, but that's his background. And then I started doing my videos over 2 years ago, November, what was it, 2015. And a few months later, my wife said, oh, why don't you put him in the videos? And that's how he's become part of the channel. So that's Billy, the credit crunch puppy. And we kept the same name, even though our previous dog was called Billy, because he already had a Billy No Mates name. So that's his story. So now, Billy, let's talk about the books that I want to talk about. The first one is an old book. I read it years ago, before I even probably started looking into banking and gold. I think it was in the 90s I bought this book. I've always been fascinated about the war and the Nazis and World War II, of course. And it's this one here, Pack of Thieves, by Richard Chesnoff. And it says here, how Hitler and Europe plundered the Jews and committed the greatest theft in history. Basically, it talks about when they used to occupy countries. They used to go to the central banks. The first thing they do, take all the gold, you know, confiscate properties from Jews, from everyone, basically. And then there's this book here, which I bought a couple of weeks ago. It's about the Bank for International Settlements, Tower of Basel, the shadowy history of the secret bank that runs the world, Adam Libor. I bought it for about £5, secondhand hardcover on eBay. So it was a bargain. It's not in tip-top condition, but it's fine. And I haven't finished reading it yet, but there's a part here in this book which talks about the Anschluss, which was when Germany took over Austria in 1938. And it's very interesting, and it's got to do, you know, with this book. And it says on page 53, the Anschluss, the Nazi annexation of Austria, is noted on pages 100 and 101 of the 1938 report as follows, and I quote, "In connection with the incorporation of Austria in the German Reich, in March and April 1938, the Austrian National Bank entered into liquidation and a series of measures were promulgated transferring most of its assets and liabilities to the Reichsbank. These assets included the Austrian National Bank's gold reserves and their 4,000 BIS shares. The BIS accepted their transfer," they put this in quotes, "to Berlin. The first many decisions that the bank's leadership would take to legitimize Nazi plunder and looting." There you go. The bank that basically allowed for this. And this bank is now in control, is the biggest regulator for international banks, the big international banks, and it's a criminal institution. I've talked about this before, how the Norwegian delegation to Bretton Woods wanted to liquidate this bank. Very difficult to close this bank because it was created through treaty at The Hague. So it's got international status, almost like a country. So unless the member countries want to lick 3/4 of the member countries, which is around 60, unless they want to liquidate this bank cannot be touched and is above the law. And it's the bank that helped Hitler and the Nazis plunder European gold from sovereign countries like Belgium, France, Austria, Czechoslovakia. Everywhere they invaded, they took, you know, they pillaged those countries and they put it through, I guess, as transfers according to the BIS, even though it was theft. And also, let's not forget all the property from Jews that they confiscated. And you can't really blame the Swiss government for that, because by, you know, the BIS is above the law. It is in Switzerland physically, but legally it's not part of Switzerland. So nobody could touch this bank. And it was the people behind this bank who created it were Montague Norman, who was governor of the Bank of England from 1920 to 1944, and Hjalmar Schacht, who was the head of the Reichsbank during Hitler's, the beginning of the Hitler regime in the 1930s. So they were they were very good buddies, and they created this bank. And basically, you know, the BIS legitimized the Nazi regime, and all throughout World War II, the Nazis were using this this bank to launder, you know, their ill-gotten gains. And now we've got this bank. That's why I think it's funny when they talk about anti-money laundering and know your client, and that these international banks have to abide by this. And the people in charge of the whole international too-big-to-fail bankers are the biggest money launderers that the world has ever seen, i.e., you know, BIS and all the Nazi loot. The other thing they talk about here, and how they put it through, you know, in their reports. It says here, territorial changes in Europe in 1938 left their impress on the banking and credit structures of the countries concerned. No shit, man. It says, the absorption of Austria into the German Reich presented comparatively few difficulties for German banking system, as Austria itself had a unified banking structure. And it says here, you know, how they took over Sudetenland and the Czech banking system. Well, they basically stole the gold. And then I wanted to go back in this book, because at the time that I read it, I probably didn't really think too much of the BIS. But on page 22, it says here, formed in 1930, that's the BIS, by the United States, Britain, Belgium, France, and Japan, and Italy as a precursor to the World Bank. The BIS initially functioned in large measure to facilitate the repayment of the reparations debt imposed on Germany after World War I. So, you know, what they do is like, they use a pretext to create these institutions. Like they said that the Federal Reserve was going to make the currency more flexible. It was going to stop financial crisis. It would make the currency elastic, And then it's become like a total central planning institution, you know, the Federal Reserve. And the same thing for the BIS. I'm sure in the back of the mind of the people behind it, you know, they say, oh, let's use the pretext that it's only for, you know, getting German reparations, but let's make it, you know, completely above the law. Let's make it sovereign by treaty. No one can touch it. But people didn't really notice that. They just thought, oh, it's to solve a big problem of German reparations after World War I. But it says here, the BIS says its current general manager, Andrew Crockett, this is a few years ago, had hopes of becoming some kind of international manager of international financial system. But, you know, it says here, the BIS was a central transmission place where deals were struck, where Portuguese representatives would meet Reichsbank representatives. So this is from Princeton historian Harold James. So, you know, so there you go. Pack of thieves. But they were, you know, that wouldn't have happened if we didn't have this BIS bank. So that's what I wanted to talk about. How can we get rid of the BIS? Well, politically, we need to convince the governments of the 60 member countries that have their central banks there operating that we need to liquidate this bank. But I don't see that happening. Who the hell knows? You know, if you speak to 100 people in the street, I'd say that 99, even more, you know, almost, and nobody knows what the BIS is. So, you know, most people are worried these days about watching the Winter Olympics or watching, you know, whatever is on television. But if you bring up the BIS, the Tower of Basel, and, you know, and you can tell them, you know, they helped Hitler and the Nazis launder all their ill-gotten gains before the war and during the war with the knowledge by all the Allied governments. America was not officially part of the BIS during the war, but because the Federal Reserve didn't want to be a member, but it allowed J.P. Morgan and the First National Bank to be members. So the president of the BIS during the war was an American. So, you know, while, you know, German allies and, you know, the Axis were fighting and millions of people died, these guys in Basel at this bank were doing business as usual. I mean, you could argue that without, you know, the BIS, there wouldn't have been a war, because how would Germany have financed the war? So really, you know, this bank should really be liquidated. How can we do it? Well, at the moment, it's untouchable. Hopefully, you know, by doing videos like this and talking about it, more and more people will find out about it. You know, if you share this video, it would be helpful to get the public to know what is really behind this BIS, Bank for International Settlements in Basel. Bad news. And it's the central bank's banker. And nothing's changed. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, share it, subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. And you can also follow me on steemit.com and on Twitter. And I'll talk to you later. Bye.